Welcome to Tech This Way.
Okay, Marcus, welcome.
Amran, thank you very much.
Hey, no
Well,
problem.
I tell you, it's an honor to be having this conversation with you, right?
Huh,
Because I get to
really?
listen to all your shows. Not all of them, because
But you've been watching. I mean, you've been listening.
Amran, you're at 25,
I am.
and I've been 25 years in Asia.
Really?
So there's a synergy here right now,
Yeah,
right? 25
yeah.
years in Asia, and you've had 25 shows. So
So let's talk about that, right? So 25 years. So what happened in 26 years ago?
26 years ago, there was a book called The Book of Wow,
Okay. Oh, you want to put the mic slightly closer?
and The Book of Wow
Yeah.
is
You can swing. You can swing the thing closer. Yeah.
yeah.
There you go.
The
The Book of Wow.
The Book of Wow is a book that I think Peter, I forgot, not Peter Drucker, but one of these management gurus wrote.
Right.
And he said, if you're young and single, you should be in Malaysia. And his whole book is a series of brain farts, what I
Right.
call brain farts. So just, paragraph here, a sentence here, an interview there. And the basic reason he said, if you're young and single, go to Malaysia, because Malaysia in 40 years is going through the same history that the United States went through in 400 years.
Oh, sorry. The book actually said Malaysia.
Go to Malaysia. I mean, it was talking about Southeast Asia,
Right.
but the interesting thing about Malaysia was
I gotta find this book.
colonial.
Huh.
U.S. was a colony. Malaysia was a colony. U.S. went through agricultural economy, through an industrial economy, to a
Service.
digital,
Yeah.
now to the service economy, right? Malaysia started out agricultural, went through an industrial, is
Yeah.
now going to a service economy, right? The challenges with race,
Yeah.
right, in both countries, right? I mean, and so Malaysia's history in 40 years is packed to what United States history is 400 years. And if you think about it, the last 25 years, Malaysia has actually gone through
Yeah.
a lot of
yeah.
that transition. So that was the whole reason.
So 26 years ago, you were where?
I was reading
When?
that book. I was
Uh-huh.
in Los Angeles.
Right.
I had just finished working I was started with Anderson Consulting. Right before that, I'd worked for Next Computers. I don't know
Okay.
if you know
Yeah, yeah.
Steve
I remember
Steve
those.
Jobs'
Yes.
computer.
That didn't quite work out after a while, but
Your iPhone is the software we wrote 25 years ago.
really,
Or
I mean,
25, 30 years ago.
into
30 years
evolved
ago.
into
Yeah,
the
yeah.
OS. Oh wow.
Yeah, yeah.
But anyway, yeah. Okay, so you
So I got onto a plane and came here in Malaysia.
and that's it. Just
Yeah.
packed up and left.
Yeah. And then I was in Malaysia for 8 years. Singapore then for 3 years, a year in Paris in between during the IMF crisis,
Yeah.
98 to 99,
Yeah.
10 years in Korea, 6 years in Japan, and 2 years ago, just after the election, I got to come back to Malaysia with a couple of roles,
Yeah.
but one of them was to build PwC's FS consulting practice.
Right.
So we have a very strong strategy practice, technology, but we didn't have that FS vertical through it. So that was my responsibility the last 2 years. And Wednesday, I get on a flight, and it's my second one-way ticket ever. So the first one was coming here, and now I'm on a one-way ticket back to San Francisco,
Wow.
so Silicon Valley. And I'm there for mid-July, I start.
Is it safe to go there right now in terms of COVID and all that? I guess they're letting you in, and then 2 weeks of.
I will find out.
So let's go back to 25 years ago. So when you got on that one-way ticket to Malaysia, what were you hoping? What were you expecting?
Malaysia was off the radar back then, right? I mean, if you was reading the newspaper, you would see more information around Singapore, Japan, Taiwan, a little bit about Thailand.
Yeah. I
But
can't count. This is 95.
94,
94. Okay.
95.
Right.
End of 94, beginning of 95. But there was a very interesting project that I had a chance of coming over here for. And it was a 2-year assignment, and it's been 25 years. But for 2 years, we were going to build a custom core banking system. You've
Okay.
talked about that before. You're quite familiar with the project.
Yeah.
And those were amazing days, right?
Yeah.
That we would do it from a ground
Yeah.
up. Everybody else was in a buy mode.
Yeah.
We were in a build mode to meet the requirements because Malaysia just wasn't ready and didn't have the customer, the vendors that were supporting it from a build base.
But from a personal standpoint, what were you hoping to do, to get or to learn?
So I had, when I wanted to leave university, to go visit all continents of the world.
Mm.
And And I had done Asia,
Yeah.
but my Asia tick was going to Turkey, jumping across the bridge, landing on the Asia side of it, and going back. But I can never say that I was
That's
really
not
in
quite.
Asia, right? I was never
Yeah.
really in Asia. And Asia, back then, I thought, okay, there's a couple of Asias. And I didn't know how diverse it was until I came here.
Was that like a typical American view of Asia? It's like, yeah, it's out there.
You know, I always like to tell people I'm not an American, I'm a Californian. You know, there's a difference, right?
Or is it?
California has got Silicon Valley, and there's the rest of the world. California, we've
Right.
got the mountains, the skiing, the beaches, the you know, the beautiful drives, and then there's the rest of the United States, and that's all struggling right now with COVID and
Yeah,
and
yeah.
everything else.
Sorry,
That's
yeah.
fine.
So you had-
So I came here. I mean, really excited first about the project. I mean, I had a brief skill that I had learned in California,
Right.
and that was a skill that was necessary here. And as I came home, I just kept getting eyes kept getting bigger and bigger and wider as you got to see what Asia was really about, right? And then extended and then continued, and those were the boom years, right?
Yeah.
Up until '98, and then we had the crisis,
Yeah.
and then of course being in a crisis situation, the IMF crisis, your eyes even open up even more, right? If you think about how fast things were changing on a day-to-day basis, not too similar to what's happened over the last 3 months. And then we came out of it, and then we had the dot-com boom years.
Yeah.
So 99, 2000, 2001, it
Kinda went
tanked
down
again.
Yeah.
And then, and so that was an exciting time. And in fact, you almost wish I would have written a book then, or even kept a more careful journal, because if you look back at what was happening during those dot-com period, right? I mean, the world was changing. People thought they were changing, and most companies from then don't exist anymore. The majority don't exist anymore.
Where were you then? Early 2000s.
So started out in Malaysia and then went to Singapore during those dot-com years. And in Singapore, the little red dot, that was the center of technology and innovation, I think, during those dot-com period, right? And then after the dot-com crash, went to Korea. Korea was, in 2002, they had the World Cup.
Yeah.
So Korea was on the radar. They were exciting. They were globalizing. If you think about it, there were three major steps for Korea, I think, or three pivot points from a global stage. The 1988 Olympics, where they went from a dictatorship to a democracy in 1988. 2002, there was the World Cup, and that's the point where I think they went from low-cost manufacturing of tennis shoes to global brands,
Right.
Samsung, LG, and so forth, and the cars, Kia. And then 2009, they hosted the G20 conference, and that's when Korea became basically a net giver of aid instead of a net receiver of aid, right? And so I got to live through two of those transitions. I got to stay in Korea during two of those transitions, which was interesting. Again, from a technology point, Samsung, LG, mobile phones, you know, being on the bleeding edge of that kind of technology.
So the move to Singapore and then to Korea, was that driven by the projects as well, or
Always
was
by
it your own
clients,
thing?
you know, always by those client opportunities to move. And then at the end of 2011, I moved to Japan. As you know, my wife is Japanese. And
Where did you meet your wife prior to that?
Oh, that's a story I haven't told you before.
No, I some
So basically, it was in Bali in '96. There
Okay.
was a conference. At the end of the conference was over.
so that's when you just moved to Malaysia at that time,
2 years after I moved, right?
right?
And you know, when you're a big white matsale, the seat on the bus is always free next to you, right?
Yeah.
It's
You-
just
you-
it's the nature of it, right?
Yeah.
So the seat was next to me free. She was the last person on the bus. She got on the bus. She saw that seat and she said, "I'm getting off the bus." But her friend told her, no, come, get back on the bus. And so we chit-chatted from there.
Okay.
And then as soon as the bus reached the destination, she dashed off. But we happened to meet again later on that
Right,
evening
right.
at a restaurant, I think, and then later at another drinking place, and then exchanged contact information.
So what? 10 years later? No. So you were back in Japan.
So then in 2012, moved to Japan.
Right.
In Japan, every place I've been to, Malaysia,
So
Singapore,
sorry, Korea then Japan.
Korea, then Japan.
Right.
And then Japan, you don't know if the economy is going this way or if the economy is going this way. It changes ever so slowly, right?
Yeah.
Unlike Korea, Malaysia, Singapore, where we always had large
You could see it,
swings
yes.
in the economic signals, right? But Japan was interesting. It was the start of when Abe-san,
Abenomics started.
correct, and I think he's one of the longest serving prime ministers now. Before that, there was a prime minister every 10, 12, 11 months. We had a new one.
Yeah.
So Japan got to enjoy a little bit of stability, which was interesting for people wanting to invest there.
Yeah.
Right? It makes a lot more sense for them. So I was 6 years in Japan, and then the opportunity came to come to Malaysia.
Yeah. So you've seen the 4 countries. 2, 3, 4. Yeah.
Well, and I had a
countries there,
chance
right?
to work in every Asian country except for Myanmar
Right.
and Laos. Laos
Yeah.
are the only ones I've never had a chance to do a project.
So what's the culturally, right? Whether it's technology or whether it's company-wise or even from a social standpoint, give a rundown of what you've observed from the Mat Salleh standpoint, right? Malaysia, Singapore, Korea, Japan. So what's the key differences?
So I think 3 or 4 things. One, there's clearly been a pivot in the last 10 years to China, right? U.S. was, a lot of the innovation came out of China, a lot of the ideas, a lot of the money, a lot of the capital came out of China.
A lot of the culture was coming from there.
A good point. A lot of the culture, TV-wise.
Yeah.
And it's pivoted to Asia. And Korean dramas, Chinese dramas are all hot right now. Technology, innovation is coming out of the Bay Area. We saw the Greater Bay Area. Greater Bay Area refers not to San Francisco Bay Area, but it refers to the southern China, Shenzhen, Guangzhou province, Hong Kong.
Yeah. Well, maybe not so much Hong Kong anymore, but yeah.
The other observation is, I think, and this is still going on, Asia progress was dominated by a lot of very strong leadership. You can dictate on the borderline of dictatorships. And now the world is trying to compare what's the right model, right?
Yeah.
And I think 15 years ago, 20 years ago, the direction was, democracy as defined by America, capitalism, economic capitalism as defined by America. And I think that's changing, especially in the last 10 years and especially in the last 5 years. And I think that's still something in progress, and we don't know what the answer is going to be.
Yeah.
Right? China is clearly driving a lot of the economic cycles right now are going to be dominated by China. Obviously, the trade wars with the United States and China are going to have an impact to all that. The other thing that is, you see more of the countries, overall there's an elevation in the economic, what do you call it? The economic goodness, right? I mean, everybody, more and more people are getting to share. They get to own a home. They get to have a car. But there's also an increasing polarization, right? The rich are getting richer, and the poor are not getting as rich as it used to be. And I think that's also something that's going to, and you see that happening over more and more, right? We talk about some countries, refer to them as developing countries, but for a large sakes, you go to any of these Asian countries and you go to the main cities, you can't tell the difference.
Yeah.
In fact, the infrastructure, the subways in Malaysia are far better than any that you see in any of our major cities in the United States, even in Europe, right? But go outside those centers, and there's not as progress, or the speed of progress isn't that much. So I think that is also going to have an impact. And we're seeing that now with COVID, right? COVID will have a pretty significant impact, I think, on the economic forecasts of the masses of the people, right?
Yeah. I guess it emphasizes the disparity, right? That,
Correct.
the guys who are comfortable, middle class and above, it's okay. It's inconvenient to not to go to work and all that, but you're not struggling per se, as opposed to the lower income bracket who suddenly have, your day earners are suddenly zero, right?
So we refer to in Malaysia the M40, B40, and T20, right?
Yeah.
And I think we're going to refer more and more to the B40 over the next 2 years.
Yeah. Even the B40 is a broad spectrum, right? You've got your B10 who is really impacted. Yeah.
Correct. But I think, I don't remember the term 5 years ago. Maybe it existed.
Yeah.
But there isn't a day that goes by or a week that goes by now where, in some contexts within work, we're always referring to the B40.
Yeah.
And that's clearly need to be a focus, right?
Yeah. I wonder if that's natural because, as you say, the overall prosperity of the country goes to a certain level that, now let's slow down a little bit and have a look at who's kind of left behind, as opposed to before when the whole country is struggling to get to a certain level.
I would argue that when I first came to Asia, there seemed to be a focus on bringing everybody up.
Yeah.
But you're right. Now they're looking at it and saying, who hasn't come up? But there isn't anywhere near the same. When I came here, Wabasan 2020, right? I mean, was really about focusing on bringing everybody up.
Yeah.
But now I think there's this observation that there's some people that haven't been able to join.
Yeah.
But I don't think there's the same emphasis on doing things to help them as there was before.
Oh, you mean there's less now than before?
I get a sense. There isn't that whole...
Right.
When I first came here, you really get a sense there was a national agenda
to get everybody
up, right? And I think that's less so now. But, it's hard to see. It's still a little microscopic point of view of history, right? We need to wait another 3, 4, 5 years to be able to have an accurate presentation. But exciting, right? To be able to be here. I mean, that's, again, the history of the United States in 40 years getting packed in to 10 years in Malaysia,
20 years.
right?
Yeah.
Right.
Now, you've had a chance to live in these countries for a period where you really get to know the country, right?
Yeah.
So talk to me about the differences between these countries that you've seen, between Malaysia, Singapore, Korea, and Japan.
So South Korea and Japan, I don't want to say monoculture, but I mean, it's clearly a single race.
Predominantly
single language,
Korean or Japanese,
single, and a much different alphabet. And that really defines the culture. Singapore, Malaysia, ethnically diverse, age group diverse, quite a different diversity. I mean, diversity is how you would describe Singapore and Malaysia in my mind. And I think the contrast between the two is very interesting, right? United States is also a diverse country, but it's nowhere near as diverse as it is here, right? I mean, here, you walk the streets here, it's, from the food walk the street here for 500 meters. The food is different from place to place. The people, the dress, the languages that you hear are quite different, which is not necessarily the same as on a broad spectrum, let's say Europe or United States. Obviously, if you go to certain parts of the United States, you're going to have that diversity. Yeah. But Malaysia, all of Malaysia is that diverse, right? It makes it interesting, right?
Yeah. But how do you see that manifest itself in when you were living in Korea and Japan, for example, right? That monoculture.
So in those monocultures, there's often a we Japanese, right? So they very clearly, us in Korea. In fact, the language in Korea, they don't say my or mine, they say our. I mean, there's a very clear, so you don't say, for example, my wife, you say 우리 wife. 우리 wife means our wife, but that's when you refer to your wife. So it's very clearly our culture or a we culture versus a lot of times the United States, they refer to as a me culture or an I culture, right?
So there seems to be a more unified community, right, as a culture, right?
Right, which makes it harder to get involved in, to become a part of, right?
Yeah.
I think in Korea, I made it a point to live in an area where there were very few expatriates. We sent our children initially to a Korean school.
Okay.
So that they would get that exposure, and it allowed us to participate in a different group. Likewise in Japan, with Masako, my wife being Japanese, of course the children went to a Japanese school. So we live in a community predominantly Japanese people. And that, I think, makes it much easier to feel part of that country than if you live in an enclave, the
expat
in an
area.
Correct. Correct. And because of that, you get to experience the country as it is, right? versus if you live, and you can experience the expatriate communities as well by going over and visiting the expatriate communities.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I guess coming back to a more technology standpoint, then, how have you seen? I'm actually sorry, I'm jumping around a little bit. I'm actually quite keen to hear from you about Korea, right? Because that was the stage when you said these companies suddenly came from nowhere. It feels like from the outside, right? Your Samsungs, your LGs were suddenly producing all these tech that was traditionally Japanese dominated in the market, right? It was always made in Japan when all the cool stuff's coming out, and then suddenly the cheaper stuff was coming out from Korea first, right? And when the cheaper stuff started to transition into the more premium, but they were still copies of technologies coming from Japan and US, to suddenly now, hey, the new things are, the new innovative stuff is coming out from Korea. Share a little bit about that transition that you probably saw, right?
So I think three things. If you look at, originally, let's say it came from United States, the transistor and those
That's right,
days,
yeah.
right? Those were days people worked hard. They worked hard. They worked long hours. They were, but I think with any place that works long and hard hours, it kind of plateaus.
Right.
And then the next place was Japan. And Japan, famous working long hours, relentless feeling of competition. We're going to succeed. And then at some point that plateaued. And then Korea came on. And then China is now moving to China, right? And China, long hours, working hard. And I think in all cases, the health, people just, as a civilization, I think there's a point where they plateau in terms of this energy and this ferociousness to compete. But that energy and that ferociousness is what creates innovation, and that desire to do it faster, cheaper, better is what takes, whether it's automobiles or technology or anything with silicon, or even the technologies related to mobile.
Yeah.
And I think you're seeing it now moving to China.
Yeah.
Right. And China has the energy, the capital, the youth that are. But what has happened in Japan? It's become an aging society. Those people that were working those long hours didn't have as many children. That demographic pyramid moved up. Same thing you're seeing in Korea. And now we're seeing that in China as well, right? And so the question is, what's next after China?
Yeah. Also, is it too early to be asking that question still?
I think so, but it's probably going to come south again. Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia.
Yeah.
You have people, you have young people, you have youth that are going to bring that energy. Yeah.
So I guess if you look at just Asia, right? Japan would be the old man of from technology standpoint, right? I think they've sustained it pretty well for a long time. Korea, then, as you said, it's taken over that mantle of pushing technology. I think today they're still there. They still at it, right? But of course,
but they become more and more specialized, right? So if you look at Japan, when we had the earthquake in 2011, I think was the earthquake.
The Fujikama, Fuji. I can't pronounce it.
No, Fuji. No, that's coming to you. But there was
the earthquake, not the
earthquake in Japan.
Not the tsunami.
The earthquake and the tsunami. There were a lot of specialized companies that were producing special solvents, special paints necessary in Korea to manufacture those semiconductors. And so people didn't realize how important Japan was for very specialized areas.
Oh, okay.
And the same thing you have today in Korea. China depends on, in Korea, there's a lot of very specialized companies building things necessary to support the evolution of technology. And what has China said? By the year 2050, we're going to be self-sufficient, right?
Oh, okay.
And at some point,
I thought it was the other way, where as Korea grew, and the intellectual property was more centered in Korea, they would just offshore the manufacturing of it to China. But you're saying it's actually
So the manufacturing, yes, but these specialized skills for these special solvents and paints and chemicals and even rare earth minerals, right?
so that that was in Korea still.
Correct. And we saw that when we had the earthquake, Fukushima,
Fukushima, that's the one.
Fukushima earthquake in Japan.
Yeah.
And so I think if you look at what COVID's going to do, and there's almost a backlash against this globalization, more and more countries, I think, are going to try to become self-sufficient.
Quite independent. Yeah.
More independent in a lot of these areas. And I think that will have an impact on innovation because innovation depends on nimbleness. And if you have another country that can cheaply, more quickly provide you with some of the raw material and you're focusing on the intellectual capital, then that's where innovation comes.
Yeah.
But if countries are self-sufficient, I don't think you're going to get the same energy and buzz within a country to have that same levels of innovation that we've seen in the last 30 years, for example.
Yeah, I think it's also boiling down to the competition, right? That when you are more open, you do have that competition coming in from the outside compared to if you isolate yourself from the other countries. Well, these are the players that you have within your country, right? That's as far and as far as
So
you
if
can
you
go,
look at
right?
history, let's say in the last 150 years, there's the made in Germany is something that stands for quality, right?
That's
You see
right.
it. But the reason that where that made in Germany came from is in the turn of the century, UK was the center of commerce, of industrial. But what they were finding was that Germany started coming in with products that were cheaper, higher quality, innovative. And so the Brits, to differentiate, forced the Germans to put that made in Germany sticker on it, right? And that was to say, this is German.
It's cheaper.
It's cheaper. It's not.
It's not.
So what happened in the 70s? America Japan put made in Japan stickers on those products.
Yeah.
And what did that mean? It was cheaper. It was
That's right.
plastic.
Yeah.
Today, higher quality. You see made in China. 10, 15 years ago, we thought made in China represent cheaper
That's
plastic.
right. Yeah.
And now you're seeing it get into higher and higher levels of quality, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that stigma of made in dash
Whatever.
over time becomes a symbol of quality.
That's right. Yeah, it was supposed to be a symbol of lower quality, right?
Correct.
It was like, oh, it's made in Japan. I remember, like, when I was a lot younger, it was like, oh, you look for the made in the US or made in England kind of products, right? And made in Japan was those cheap stuff, right? Cheap, nasty
The
things.
toys and
correct,
the
right? That doesn't last long,
plastic and the little transistor radios.
Yeah. Then suddenly making in Japan,
And
was
then
the stuff that
Sony
you want.
was the Walkman.
That's right.
And
Certainly made in China, probably still now is one of the don't even touch, right? But
I think
companies like Xiaomi said, hey, you know what? We're gonna do it better, cheaper, but quality, right?
And you look at it beyond technology. I mean, technology in a grander scheme. Some of the greatest advances in high-speed railway now are coming out of China, right?
Yeah.
And the signaling equipment and the technology required to integrate this larger ecosystem is coming out of China.
That's true. And I think because of the size, when we were talking about transitioning from Japan and Korea taking over and then China taking over from Korea, perhaps the size of China itself gives it enough of a runaway for even within China to have the competition. Right?
Yeah, and the interesting thing, there really isn't one China, right? So if you look at it, the centers of commerce started on the coastline.
The edges, yeah.
And now those are probably some of the more expensive places to be. So China is relentlessly, the manufacturing, those innovations are moving inland and inland. And some of the largest cities in the world now are in inland China, right?
Yeah.
At some point, it'll stop. There's a desert. It can't. There's the mountains. It's going to stop.
Yeah.
But there's at least 30 years of runway before that'll happen.
Yeah. And the the one road, one belt kind of programs, I think that's the key to that, isn't it? Just to push things further away from the coast.
And it's the same thing what the United States did, Bretton Woods, right? Post World War II.
Don't know.
Was
When was that?
to help integrate the economies, help the European economies, the Marshall Plan, Bretton Woods, both from a financial, for the financial schemes, but also the investment schemes to help those countries, right? Same thing happening today, which helps to create a more integrated economy, therefore a market, a destination for the goods that China produces, the infrastructure, the technology that China produces, right? So the question becomes, how can Malaysia be part of that, right?
That's right. Yeah. And I think in Southeast Asia anyway, they were always looking at. In fact, I don't think Malaysia was part of the equation per se, because everybody was looking at Vietnam and Cambodia as the next big manufacturing hub or Thailand even, right? So Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia. How do you see that playing out?
I think two things. One is people recognize that you can't depend on one country. So when we had the flooding in Thailand, I think the world suddenly realized how many automobile parts were being made in Thailand that stopped the factories in Japan from manufacturing cars because the supply chains were disrupted in Thailand. And I think since then, plus Fukushima earthquake, countries have realized you cannot single source your products. So I think there's an opportunity for Malaysia. I don't think Malaysia's taken advantage of that yet, right? I think in Malaysia, things are good in Malaysia, right? There was an expression once somebody said that, you can plant rice tomorrow as well, right? It's you don't have a winter. It's not like in China where in Korea, if you don't plant vegetables today, they're not going to be able to harvest before the winter and you're going to die. And we don't have that sense of urgency or milestone. I mean, there's a milestone. And I think in Malaysia, things have gotten very good. But I think at some point we're going to recognize in Malaysia that, to get better, we're going to have to innovate and get back into that cycle. And Malaysia realized that from the beginning, and I think Malaysia's plateaued a little bit in this area. And I don't know what the next inspiration will be, but there's a tremendous market in Vietnam, tremendous market in Laos, Cambodia, Indonesia, right? A lot of cultural compatibility with Indonesia to be able to support the growing Indonesian economy. One area where I always think that Malaysia can do well is, as you know, the digital banking licenses are going to come out.
Well, we'll see
very soon. Soon at some point.
Pushed back a little bit.
So a lot of the attention today for digital banking license has been focused on Hong Kong and Singapore. Hong Kong and Singapore are islands. The demographics, the needs of the consumer base there are much different than in Malaysia, right? And Malaysia goes back to that B40. If you're successful with those digital banking licenses in Malaysia, that model will work in the Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, Myanmar. You can take that, Sri Lanka. You can take the models that work in Malaysia and be successful in other countries. And I think that's going to be a tremendous opportunity for Malaysian financial services companies, Malaysian fintechs, to develop the technologies necessary to allow people to be profitable, focusing on non-traditional banking customer segments, i.e. the B40, right?
So if you look at Philippines and Cambodia and Vietnam, right, and compare these three to Malaysia, one of the key factors is population, right? They have 70 million, 80 million upwards. Do you think there is a real risk of those countries themselves developing these solutions? And unfortunately, if Malaysia doesn't move fast enough, they will skip. Malaysia will miss out on that development because they have the ready markets. Within the country.
I don't think there's a risk that those countries will develop the solutions themselves as versus China coming in. Right?
Okay.
I mean, you see China, you mentioned earlier the Belt and Road. You see tremendous interest by a lot of Chinese affiliated companies with the digital banking license in Malaysia. You see a lot of that technology being developed in regions in China that could be replicated for the similar situation in Malaysia. So I think the opportunity or the the risk isn't that those countries themselves develop the technologies versus Malaysia not being fast enough to be able to grab those opportunities themselves. And Malaysia has already the language and the cultural affinity to those countries more so than China, right?
But there's two things there, right? So one of the arguments on why China's been able to have such a good run at technology growth is because of the controls that the country has, the government has imposed, right? That everything's managed very well, and therefore they were able to channel whatever technology in a single direction. Everybody has to comply, right? As opposed to a more open
Imran,
market.
I would maybe, I don't think, and I'm not a Chinese expert or China,
Sure.
but what I observe is there's things that are controlled in China, but there's a lot that's not controlled. And therefore, and there's a lot of encouragement, and there's a lot of, run, entrepreneurship. What we hear about getting controlled, we read about it, we see about it, but I see there's a tremendous amount of the economy and China that's not controlled. That's as free and as laissez-faire as you'd see anywhere else in the world. And that is what's driving, I think, the growth in China.
Right.
There isn't a lot of communist-owned infrastructure as much as there is that. I mean, I would say in many ways China's becoming an ultimate capitalist, right?
Yeah. And perhaps on the contrary, then, how the government has managed it allows for the development to be faster and grow at speed.
And I think you look at these companies, Alibaba, clearly there's a support and participation with government-affiliated organization, but that is a company that has gone full speed, taking advantage of every opportunity that existed in China, and it wasn't controlled and managed by China.
Yeah.
Right? And then I think that's what differentiates the current Chinese environment from a lot of other countries around the world, whether it's in Europe, North America, especially.
Yeah. You spoke about, the hard work that precedes the success of those countries, right? And you also mentioned that in Malaysia, hey, things are good. It can be a lot better, but things are good, right? And therefore, the hunger may not be there as much. So definitely in Cambodia, Vietnam, or even the Philippines, perhaps they're hungrier than Malaysia to get out of where they are. Is that a fair assessment?
I don't know. I don't know if they were hungrier. I would say, individually, I mean, if you look at Philippines, it's one of the outsourcing centers of the world. So you have outside forces coming in and taking advantage of the people, willingness to work, willingness to learn new things, to participate, but that's still driven by external factors. Yeah. It's not internal factors. You see that in Vietnam as well. You see all these large companies, in fact, more manufacturing, I understood, or a tremendous amount of manufacturing for South Korea is now done in Vietnam. I think some of the largest factories by some of the large Korean conglomerates are now in Vietnam. Okay. But again, these are outside forces coming into those countries. It's not a internally generated momentum, right? I mean, the momentum is not coming internally. The momentum is coming from outside, and that's driving.
So the outside is seeing the opportunity and then going in.
Correct. And you see that in the Philippines. But there isn't a lot of Filipino economies that are doing that. Malaysia, I think, is a little bit different. There is a lot of Malaysian companies with support of the government, but there isn't as many entrepreneurs. One of your earlier sessions was with Jasmine, an entrepreneur. Yeah. I like that session because...
Recommend,
Recommend.my, because that's an entrepreneur. That's that. I almost think that's rare in Malaysia, right?
Not rare.
You think it's not rare?
I don't think it's rare.
I don't think there's enough of them. And I like that podcast because it was an entrepreneur sharing her experiences of trying to build a business in Malaysia, right?
Mm.
And I don't think you have as many in Malaysia as we should or could
Right.
have.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's, to a certain level, it's the success of the corporates in Malaysia, right? Because everybody who, if you stick to the standard path, right? You go to high school, then you go to uni. There's a job in some corporate somewhere that you can get to. And unless you come from a background within your family that has businesses, right, or you yourself has that innate need to set up your own, you wouldn't go into a business of your own, right? So perhaps that's some of the why we don't have as many.
One of your other recent podcasts,
Mm.
one of the more recent ones, was a Malaysian doing business in Germany.
Yes, Cloud Motion. So he left. Why was he in? He was in France, and then he met up with a couple of guys, and then he set up in Germany. So
I think that's another interesting story, but we don't have enough of those stories.
we don't.
Unlike
not
Taiwan, right? Taiwan, you had a lot of Taiwanese who immigrated to the United States and built up businesses over there, right? And
in fact,
I would hope to see that we'd see more Malaysians doing that kind of work around the world.
That brings up this the issue of brain drain in Malaysia, right? Where we've had this fixation that when Malaysians leave Malaysia, it takes away with it, obviously the skill sets and all that, but therefore it leaves Malaysia all the poorer, right? Whereas I don't agree with that completely, because I think no matter how far you leave Malaysia, right, there is always still some part of you that makes you Malaysian, and that link to your home country will always be open to pushing back some kind of either it's technology or contact or knowledge back to Malaysia, right? So the more Malaysians you have out there, it makes Malaysia richer, because we do have that access to Malaysians elsewhere. So things like Motion Cloud, right, for example, exactly, right? So he's out there. He said he's doing well, and he will come back eventually. But if he wasn't there, we would never have a Motions Cloud network in Germany, right, coming back to Malaysia. So I don't see why we're so fearful of Malaysians leaving Malaysia.
Yeah, and the other thing I talked earlier, I mean, the diversity in Malaysia, the language. I think Malaysia would be even stronger. I mean, there are a lot of successful businesses, BPO type businesses centered in Malaysia, but I think there's a tremendous opportunity in Malaysia to do even more because of the diversity of the languages, let alone the Chinese dialects, right, that you can find here. Where else, what other country on the world can you find as many languages, Thai, Malay, Bahasa, the different Chinese dialects, very strong English skills? There isn't another country that has that capability, right? But I think there should be almost a bigger opportunity or more momentum in that space than there is, and I hope there will be going forward. Cyberjaya was always supposed to be a catalyst for that. I think it's still in progress, but there's still a tremendous opportunity for Malaysia to take advantage of that diversity, and to your point, all that brain power that exists outside of Malaysia to bring it back into Malaysia.
There's certainly potential, right? And I wonder sometimes situations like right now that we're in, right, with MCO and the challenges that might give rise to even more entrepreneurs. Right?
So the one thing that keeps getting quoted is that the last 4 months have accelerated digital change by 4 years, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So I think by the end of the year, we will see if that statement is true. And if that statement is true, then hopefully Malaysia will be very much a part of that, right?
Yeah.
But there's more infrastructure required in Malaysia for do that. You need more cloud companies based in Malaysia, right? You have some of the major cloud companies that are still not based in Malaysia.
Yeah.
And if Malaysia is a hub for that, it's a catalyst for all other types of industries. And you see that with Silicon Valley, right? Silicon Valley started with Stanford University and some of the other universities at Berkeley, and that was a catalyst for innovation, which then an ecosystem evolved around that. And I still think Malaysia's early in that area, but has all the right ingredients to make it happen.
So specifically on that, if there were a bunch of techno geeks out there who wants to jump on this opportunity, what kind of opportunities do you see they should be going into?
So, um, so anything around digitalization for scale, digitalization at scale. So if we want to go into Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines, as you talked earlier, large population bases, you want to be able to do digitalization at scale. You want to have 10 agents be able to support 10,000 customers, 100,000 customer base, because you have automated chat sessions, bot sessions, and so some of those technologies required it to be able to support it at scale. I think Malaysian companies should be going after those markets. You have the language capabilities here. I think there's some of the technologies exist, but there isn't that need to go outside of Malaysia. And I think Indonesia, of course, will be a big opportunity for Malaysia, given just the proximity, but also the compatibility with the culture and the language. I think it's. I mean, there's a tremendous opportunity.
So in the offset, don't look at scaling something that you do in a later stage, but start thinking about scaling right from the beginning. As the inception of your business, scaling is the key to whatever.
And that's what digitalization will all be about, right? How do you get? Well, I mean, there's also the society challenges that are going to happen. There are going to be less and less jobs. We talk about robots, automation, providing opportunities for fewer people when you get at the scale. So, I mean, there's a flip side of that technology that we need to look at going forward, because you're not going to be creating as many jobs with this digitalization wave as we have over the last 20 years, the next 20 years. And I think, one of the things is the year 2020 is the start of a decade.
Yeah.
And up until now, we've had the 90s, which we saw tremendous technology growth. And then we went to the zeros or the noughts. It's just an awkward name, right? And then we went to the tens. It's an awkward name. And now we have, for our generation, the 20s and the 30s and the 40s coming ahead, where we can talk about the same level of change that happened in the roaring 20s, 1920. In the 30s, 1930s, right?
Yeah.
It's going to be our 20s and 30s and 40s. And I think if we were to go in 2050 and look back, the next 10 years is going to be the most change. And part of it is coming from COVID. I think that's accelerating it. Part of it is coming from some of the political challenges that are happening around the world. And as well as this relentless drive for technology. And if we're successful in Southeast Asia, the next market is Africa.
Yeah.
The next market will be South America, right? Where you don't have these centers of technology hubs like we have here in Malaysia. And there's some compatibility, again, with the language that can make Malaysians successful in Africa as well. If you look out 20 years ahead.
We kind of skipped Indonesia. Now that's 200 million people. Obviously, I don't know, maybe about
more than that, huh? 280 million or something. Yeah, tremendous.
And if you talk about all the corporates, right? Maybe 10 years ago, all eyes on Indonesia, right? Everybody needs to set up offices there. Everything's growth. But unfortunately, for the last 5 to 10 years, it has not reached the kind of returns that everybody was eyeing for 5-6 years ago. What happened to Indonesia?
Indonesia is coming back. I see Indonesia tremendous. First of all, you have more political stability, which I think is one of the key ingredients. So Indonesia is coming back. For us within our firm, it is a tremendous opportunity. An area where we're investing in, an area where we're bringing our talent.
Because we heard exactly that, say 6-7 years ago, right? So
but you didn't have that political stability those last 6-7 years, right? You're only starting to get that stability again. And that's a key ingredient for companies, investors wanting to spend time and money in those countries, right?
And I think there was security and safety issues even back then, right?
Correct. Indonesia will be a tremendous market. And again, an opportunity for Malaysia technology companies to be able to focus on.
Yeah. Rather than see it as a competition coming from Indonesia, it's actually, hey, that's 280 million potential customers too. Right?
Correct. Yeah, correct.
Mm.
And these are all customers that have digital phones,
Mm.
right? Not the old style phones, digital phones.
Yeah.
The youth, tremendous energy among the youth there. So similar to what South Korea was like 20 years ago, right?
Yeah. So looking forward a little bit then, within the region, and also then for you personally, before you take your, well, hopefully not the last time leaving us. I'm sure you'll be back.
You know, I always say California is part of Asia Pacific, right?
Yeah, it is on the other side of the rim.
So it's just
know?
a time zone change, but I'm
That's
still
it.
in Asia Pacific, right?
Yeah. So looking forward for the region, where do you see things happening? If you had a dollar to bet on, where would it be in Southeast Asia?
I would take that dollar and carve it out. A significant part of that investment would be on Vietnam and in Indonesia, Malaysia. Singapore will always be relevant. You know, Singapore is in the center there.
Yeah.
Both from trade, from the aviation hub. I mean, it'll always be a center. There'll be a lot of talent in Singapore. I would start early thinking Philippines will become very exciting. Again, you have technology is just starting to reach the same levels that you have in Indonesia. They are getting stability also in their government over there. Again, one of the key ingredients for setting the foundation for that type of investment. So if I had $10, I'd put $4 in Indonesia, $2 to $3 in Malaysia. You always have to keep $1 in Singapore, and then I spend the rest of it across, Vietnam, Thailand. Myanmar will be a tremendous opportunity, I think. Again, if you look out at 20 years.
Yeah. For Singapore, it's interesting, right? So they've always been so tightly coupled with the US and Europe to a certain extent, the UK anyway. With the US turning the way it is, right? Quite insular. Do you see a risk for Singapore losing that link to the US?
Singapore has always been clever of having diplomatically their hands in China, in Europe, in United States, and within Southeast Asia. I think we will have to speak in December again to see what happens with the election results.
Yes. Is it Trump 2020 or Biden?
I think the next 4 weeks, the rhetoric will heat up. And when I say heat up, it'll get very, very hot. But my sense is that people will get so exhausted of it that after the November elections, the focus will go back to normal. But we'll have to see what'll happen in November, and we can have this conversation again in December.
Sure. Let's move on a little bit from the geopolitics to technology per se. There's always, from out of China, it's always been the ABC, right? Your analytics and your big data and your cloud. Do you see those three things still being the driver of a lot of the change in the technology moving forward? Are there any specific niche
maybe now
things?
it's A, B, C, D, and D being the broader digital, right? Anything digital, right? And digital, to me, is a commonization. And what's starting to happen is people are developing products that you can sell digitally. I focus on financial services, right? So insurance products tend to be very complex and require that face-to-face selling. But people know they need insurance, but they don't know how to buy it. But I think people are going to start developing insurance products that then they just get digitally. They don't even need to meet somebody. And the regulations. I think in Malaysia, EKYC is not having that is a roadblock.
Yeah.
25 years ago, I was able to open a bank account in the United States, having never visited a branch. And I think just sending them by postal mail, a couple of weeks later, a photocopy of one of my identification cards. but we don't have that yet in Malaysia, right? You still require a wet signature on so many things. So I think that D is going to be digitalization, and it'll focus on products that are adapted to be sold or serviced over those other ABC technologies that we've talked about, right? Customers are going to be expecting it, especially with COVID-19. They don't want, you saw e-commerce, tremendous boost. People realize, this is what I need.
Yeah.
I don't want to go to a mall and find a parking, drive around finding a parking spot when I can just click it and it comes 2-3 days later, right?
And I think that's probably a long-lasting behavior change that is caused, right? As opposed to, well, when COVID's over, we'll go back to the way we were.
The world has changed.
I think that has really changed it.
The world has changed. People are expecting different, and it's changed. We talk about the last 4 months have accelerated things by 4 years, without a doubt.
What was there anything that's negative about what's happened? And obviously not from the health standpoint, but from a technology standpoint, has it stunted anything instead?
So I had an early conversation with somebody about this, and I don't think education and the delivery of education is ready. So much of what we learn still depends on universities and classrooms for large groups of people. Of course, there are a lot of self-taught, self-made technology evangelists, experts, but clearly the whole education is not adapted to this new way. The way we educate people, the way people learn among each other has not adopted. We've talked about distance learning for 10, 15, 20 years now. I think that'll be something that needs to change to be able to support that. And that's the negative. A lot of people talk about education not being up to the task yet.
And I guess you're talking about more than just the logistics of how the classroom is being run, right? It's about the content.
It's the interaction, right?
Yeah.
It's even the competition for getting A's with your fellow students, right? I know some universities in the United States that went to pass-fail. When you go pass-fail, that ability or that desire to get that A versus I'll get a B or even a C and I do just as well, right?
Yeah. That's lost something, right? Because I remembered when there was a system in Malaysia for my kids, they were saying, it's similar to a pass-fail, right? But the first question would be, but how did you do with the rest of the guys, right? And they said, we don't know. We just got it, right? It's like, so how well is well, right? How good is good? How bad is bad, right? And that granularity, somehow you still need to figure it out without falling into that same trap of, you're just hitting the books to get your 100%, right? It is beyond that.
So I think 5 years from now, looking back, we're going to look at education as not having adapted to this new world, this new environment. And again, a tremendous opportunity for somebody to figure it out, right?
Yeah.
How to be able to do this education to the masses. I mean, you can have an education, theoretically, you can have an education of a top quality university delivered at scale, but it's not there yet.
Yeah. I think there were some starts and stops on that, right? A lot of online universities and all these institutes, which is quite good. But I think the traditional way of education is obviously still king. I seem to remember, these homeschools used to get a bit of flack. Still probably perhaps before MCO, right? Before COVID, where these are more hippie type parents who want to try something new, and then you realize today, hey, hang on a minute, this homeschool thing, there's something to it, right? It's not just about the logistics of having to send your kids to school, but it's also the content and the emphasis that you're giving to your
the
kids,
cadence and maintaining that cadence is important as well.
Yeah, and the fact that it is, like everything else in retail, it's customized, right? This is not about teaching the same thing for 40 kids in the same room, right, at the same standard. But hey, my kids are stronger here and less there, and therefore you cater your education system to that child, as opposed to, let's get the average, because that's where pretty much you'll hit everybody, right? But the guys who are above or below the bell curve kind of suffer, right?
Hey, Arman, I've been 25 years in Asia. You've done 25 years of podcasts. What have you learned from your 25 years of podcasting?
There's a lot more to learn. I think that's what I've learned. Right? I think.
I mean, what was the most earth-shattering, exciting, or aha moment that you've had with the really incredible diversity of people that you had a chance to discuss?
I think it's really the commonality amongst most of them in terms of vision and drive. Right. So one is it's about really finding out stuff that you want to do and doing it because you enjoy it. Right. And it's such a stereotype, right? I mean, it's such a cliche. Oh, follow your passion. But what I've seen so far with a lot of them, it is true, right? Whether the passion is directly with what you do, or the passion is to achieve something, and I have to do this to drive that, right? I had this conversation with my kids, my eldest, who loves to cook, right? And she says, "Yeah, I want to do this, right? Because I'm passionate about this, and I want to do." But I was telling her, look, if it doesn't pay the bill, then the passion can only go so far, right? Obviously, she doesn't want to listen to that. Right? And then we had this. So there was this one open day at the university, and the career counselor said, "Look, you have your passion, and if you're lucky, the passion will sustain you. But if it doesn't, make sure you get to do something that you're actually good at. You may not be passionate about it, but you're good at that can sustain you, and that will fuel your passion, right?" And what I've realized with talking to all these guys is between those two, right? Is those guys who are lucky enough to find a passion, and it also pays the bills, or the guys who are passionate about something, but hey, you know what? I'm going to do this because that will fuel what I'm really passionate about.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is, how do you give that opportunity for so many people to be able to enable their passion, right?
Yeah.
I mean, my passion 25 years ago was to come to travel, to come to Asia, to do something new. But I was given that opportunity
through those projects, right? And
through the projects, but also by reading a book that inspired me onto that.
Yeah. So that's one, and the other one is about this sense of community that most of these guys have, as opposed to the very me trying to achieve success. Now it's a lot about, well, I'm doing this, but you know what? There is a greater good that I want to try and achieve, right? So, and I don't know whether
sense of purpose, right?
Sense of purpose, right? Again, is that big motherhood statements? Maybe as Gen X's, we had to do things to survive in a way, right? So this community thing had to go in the back burner, right? As opposed to now, the slightly younger generation, that becomes a factor before they do something, right? That becomes in a front burner, right? As I pursue something that I want to do, the giving back to the community becomes a more prominent factor than before. For us, it's like, hey, you know what? Let's. I'm sure when I'm older and I'm retired, I'll go and help out. But for these guys, it's a little bit more prominent.
You know, I think with the roaring 20s, our 20s, the 20s that we'll get to experience, the decades, I think that sense of purpose is going to be more profound than it has. I mean, part of it, given some of the challenges we have from a society point of view, we're seeing now. But I think also from a technology point of view, people are going to see some of the negative sides of technology that they're going to want to respond to and address.
Yeah.
But you talked about, is there something else around the negative side?
Yeah. And the other thing on that is how we find ourselves judging each other. Meaning, in the good old days, you've got to have a title, you've got to have that good car, you've got to have those materialistic things, and therefore within society you are of a certain level, right? And it feels like everybody's judging each other on the same scale. As opposed to now, it's changed a little bit where, okay, your material stuff fine, but actually how much have you helped, right? Oh, this guy is actually leading some kind of an NGO. This guy's active in doing, whatever, helping society, right? And that has greater weight in terms of how I judge you now, right? And I find there is that shift, right? Because people don't talk about, oh, he's the CEO of somebody. Oh, he earns this much. That material rat race, is slowly falling away too. Because if I talk to my kids, and when they look up to people, it's not so much looking up to how materially successful they are, right? It is now looking up to people who have had impact on society and other people. So, and therefore, I think on the other side of it, if I was going to go and say, hey, if I'm going to pursue my passion between what sustains me or that has an impact, it's okay to go do things which is, less materially but more from the impact standpoint, because everybody's judging me based on the other thing now, right? It's not just how well I've done, right?
But is that across the board, or is that a smaller segment of people that are in that area?
Don't know.
I think it's a smaller segment that just happened to have a bigger impact, but it's not as common. And
or is it also depends on who you're speaking to in terms of how far they've got in society, right? Meaning, if you go to Myanmar, right, would the up and coming 25-year-old in Myanmar be talking about social impact, or is it more about survival? Because they're just about going through that economic cycle now, right, where they're growing. Compared to in Singapore, the same 25-year-old will say, hey, you know what, economically we're okay. Let's start talking more about giving back. So I don't know whether that's...
No, and I think you're going to see that, again, the future in the 30s, 40s will be Africa, right? I mean, it's a phenomenal, hundreds of millions of people that'll become an economy down there that are now going through their own sense of purpose. Early days, right?
Yeah.
We talk about blood diamonds, for example,
That's right,
right?
yeah.
And technology is
Do it for the
helping
money
in that
first,
area, right? The ability to scan them and
Yeah.
identify them and certify them, right?
Yeah. So let's take this home for you. So
Because I'm going home, right?
Because
I'm
journey,
going
exactly,
home.
right? So the journey back. So what's the expectations? Where do you see Marcus in 5 years, 10 years from now? What are you expecting?
So
back home?
traditionally in the consulting career, you finish at 60, right? So I've got a 6-year runway to do what I want to do. This time of the year, a lot of partners are retiring. And you go to these, now digitally, you used to go to these sessions and raise a glass, and people would say things about them, a bit of a roast, a bit of a little thank you, a little bit of congratulations, right? And it's this time of the year where you always think about, what are people going to say about me?
What's your legacy?
Yeah, what's going to be my legacy? The last couple of weeks, I've got a sense of what my legacy will be like in Malaysia and Southeast Asia. But for the next 6 years, I want to focus on bringing that level of intensity that I talked about missing in the United States around digitalization in financial services in the United States. And where we're going to see it, where, in the last couple of months I've been talking to people, is some of the banks have gotten so big in the United States. It's the smaller regional mid-sized banks that are driving this innovation, either through mergers, sharing of technologies, and they are the ones that I think are much closer to a lot of the masses, insurance companies and banks. And so for the next 6 years, I want to be a part of that. I want to work with not necessarily the bigger firms, but those mid-sized firms, which I think are going to be driving a lot of the more interesting aspects of how financial services are changing. We talk about in Malaysia digital banking. To me, it's about digital financial services. It's being able to have banking, insurance, asset management, your investment, health protection is part of that as well. And so what I want to do is just be a part of that for the next, I have a 6-year runway.
Do you think there is a burning platform for that change to really drive it?
Because of COVID, because of the society changes, yes, absolutely. In the U.S., we talk about certain demographic groups not having access to the same financial services capabilities as other groups. And I think fundamentally that will change. What has gone on for the last, within the last 4, 5, 6 months, arguably maybe the last 3 years, will drive fundamental changes in how the smaller financial services firms are going to offer their services, their products to demographic groups that weren't traditionally seen as profitable or a market worth serving, right? And I think it'll be very interesting to be helping and supporting those types of companies in this area.
Okay. All right then, Marcus.
And spend more time with my family.
Yeah.
You know, they
always a
haven't
good
been in
thing.
Malaysia. I've been by myself here in Malaysia.
Have they lived in the US before?
I've lived more outside the U.S. than I've lived in the U.S.
Wow. So they're looking forward to the move back as well.
Absolutely.
Well, not move back, move to.
Yeah, move to. Yeah.
Yeah. Where in
So
California?
we'll be in San Francisco in the
Okay.
Bay Area,
Nice.
Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
You know, most people think of financial services firms and technology being in New York, Boston, on the East Coast, but the West Coast is clearly an up-and-coming area in this space. And I think part of it is because of also the closeness to Asia, right? Both the affinity of many Asians moving to California, but also that direction of California firms focusing on Asia, because it's part of Asia Pacific, California.
Yeah. You got that in the name. Okay. Anyway, all the best.
Amran,
Good luck.
I got to know you 25 years ago. I don't know if you remember, but we sponsored a company outing a long time ago.
Yeah, the bum.
And I came across, it was not a
Is it
bum,
out?
it was the legendary bum.
Oh, wow.
I don't know if you remember that.
I do.
So I came
This is the one that I had to drive a van or something.
Yeah, we
Remember?
drove
Yeah.
across to Guantan and then up the coast. And that
97.
was you and I that organized the legendary
That
bum.
was fun. That was a good laugh.
Yeah. And so all these times that I've had the chance to get to know you and work with you, I appreciate that. And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the friendship, huh?
Yeah. Same here. It's been a pleasure. I'll hook up with you in San Francisco in the next couple of years. Who knows?
And I'll get to start the interview there.
Yeah, I'll do.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marcus. Bye-bye.